What if I told you that the biggest empire of its time fell apart not after years of fighting, but in just one day? One sunrise, one sunset, and the world's power completely changed, as if someone had drawn a line in the sand. On the hot plain of Gaugamela, it wasn't just two armies fighting, but two different ways of thinking about power, war, and fate itself. We will send the Persians to the center as a fight. On one side was a young king, only 25 years old, a man who believed that the world was made to be conquered. On the other was the King of Kings, ruler of an empire stretching from Egypt to the borders of India, owner of countless soldiers, treasures, and legendary glory. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one smart plan allowed Alexander to trick an army that was much bigger than his. Why Darius himself had to run away from the battlefield. And how this single day destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, sending it into history books. What if I told you that everything Darius believed in was built on a foundation that was already breaking? To survive. By the time Alexander invaded, the Persian Achaemenid Empire was a giant, but a giant standing on feet of clay. It was a state stretching from India to Egypt, put together from dozens of peoples, cultures and languages, held together only by the will of one man, the King of Kings. This system worked well during peaceful times, but it turned out to be weak when facing a strong and quick outside enemy. Darius III himself was a ruler who was more tragic than bad at his job. He became king at a difficult time, taking over an empire weakened by inside fighting and palace takeovers. He didn't have Alexander's military genius or the unquestionable authority of his great ancestors such as Cyrus or Darius I. He was mostly an administrator forced to become a commander at the most important moment in his people's history. The previous defeats at Granicus and Issus were not just military losses. They were deep psychological blows. Alexander proved that the Persian military machine was not unbeatable. Each Macedonian victory sent waves of doubt throughout the provinces. The loyalty of many governors and vassal kings, based more on fear and self-interest than on devotion, began to shake. That is why the Battle of Gaugamela was Darius's last chance. He could no longer afford to retreat or lose. He needed one big victory to restore his authority and prove that he was still the King of Kings. He gathered all the forces his empire could bring together, bringing warriors from all corners of his empire from Bactria to Babylonia to one plain. The problem with this huge army was its diversity. It included Greek mercenaries, Bactrian cavalry, Indian elephants, and powerful Scythian horsemen. But they spoke different languages, fought differently, and obeyed different commanders. They lacked the unity and brotherhood in arms that bound the Macedonian phalanx, which had gone through fire and water under the command of their king. Alexander, on the other hand, led an army of veterans. His soldiers were battle-hardened, believed completely in their leader, and acted as a single well-coordinated team. They fought not for an abstract empire, but for their king, for glory, and for very real rewards. It was a clash between a professional, motivated army and a huge but loose feudal militia. Darius also relied on scare tactics, especially his famous scythed chariots. He thought that just seeing this weapon charging at the enemy would cause panic and break their formation. It was a gamble on fear rather than tactics, which in itself showed the Persian command's lack of confidence in its own strength. Psychological pressure on Darius was enormous. He had staked everything: his army, his empire, his dynasty, and his life. He knew there would be no second chance. This battle would either be his greatest triumph or his final downfall. All of Persia held its breath, waiting for the outcome. Alexander, on the other hand, was in his element. He was a predator who had cornered his prey. He saw weakness in Darius's showy power and was ready to use it. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to destroy his enemy, break his will, and take his place. Gaugamela became the stage for this final act. Thus, even before the first clash on the battlefield, the Persian Empire was psychologically broken. It was ready to fall apart from a single precise and powerful blow. Alexander only had to find the place to strike, and he found it. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. Do you think Darius had a chance of winning, or was the empire doomed anyway? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our analysis of other great battles. Are you ready to learn the truth about what really made Alexander different from Darius? It was not just armies that fought on the field at Gaugamela, but two personalities, two ways of thinking. On one side was Alexander, young, charismatic, educated by Aristotle, but toughened in battle. He was a tactical genius who didn't just command an army. He was its heart and brain. His soldiers saw him fighting alongside them and were ready to follow him anywhere. Darius III, on the other hand, was a product of a completely different system. He was an emperor who ruled from a luxurious palace, used to having his will obeyed without question. He was an experienced administrator and definitely a brave man. But he was not a soldier to the core like Alexander. His role on the battlefield was that of a supreme observer, not an active participant. Alexander's style of command was based on personal initiative and trust. He shared his plans with generals such as Parmenion and Craterus and expected from them not blind obedience but intelligent execution. He trusted his men, and they trusted him. This flexibility allowed the Macedonian army to respond instantly to changing situations. Darius, on the other hand, commanded his army through a complex hierarchy of satraps and military commanders, many of whom owed him loyalty but did not always have military talent. His army was huge but clumsy. It was difficult to give orders to such a large number of diverse troops and even more difficult to ensure their precise execution. Any delay or miscommunication could be deadly. Show no fear. The Macedonian army was basically professional. The phalanx and companion cavalry were warriors who had devoted their entire lives to this cause. They trained together, fought together, and were bonded by years of joint campaigns. Their equipment was standardized and functional, from short xiphos swords to long sarissa spears. The Persian army was a patchwork quilt. It had magnificent units such as the Immortals or the Bactrian cavalry. But alongside them stood militias recruited from distant provinces, armed with whatever they could find and with no experience of fighting a disciplined phalanx. Their motivations varied. Some fought for the king, others because they were forced to. Their psychological attitudes also differed greatly. Alexander and his army were at their peak, going from victory to victory, feeling invincible. They were invaders full of energy and desire to reach the ends of the earth. They viewed the Persians as rich rewards that were just waiting to be taken. Darius's army, on the other hand, was on the defensive. They were fighting for their home, which should have given them strength. But previous defeats had weakened their confidence. The soldiers saw that the Macedonians were not just another bunch of barbarians from the edges, but a new powerful force that their commanders did not know how to deal with. Alexander thought in terms of movement and strike. He always looked for a weak spot in the enemy's formation to deliver one decisive blow. His tactics were flexible and aggressive. He was willing to take risks because he believed in his genius and in his soldiers. Darius thought in terms of numbers and overwhelming force. He believed that his huge army, his chariots, and his elephants would simply sweep away the small enemy. His plan at Gaugamela was static. He chose a field, built an army, and waited for the enemy to crash into his ranks. He was not prepared for Alexander to dictate the terms himself. Which leadership style do you think is more effective in a crisis situation? Flexibility and risk-taking or reliance on overwhelming power? But Darius had a surprise in store. A weapon that was supposed to tear the Macedonian formation to shreds. In the next chapter, we will see how Alexander faced the main weapon of fear of the Persian army. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret. How Alexander neutralized Darius's most fearsome weapon without even engaging in battle. Darius placed special emphasis on his scythed chariots. This weapon was designed not so much to cause physical damage as to cause psychological terror. Imagine a heavy cart with long sharp blades attached to its wheels rushing at a dense formation of infantry. The mere sight of it was enough to sow panic. Show no mercy. Darius placed about 200 such chariots in the center of his formation. He was so confident in their effectiveness that he even ordered his soldiers to level and clear the entire plain in front of his formation of stones. He wanted nothing to prevent this deadly battering ram from reaching maximum speed and crashing into the heart of the Macedonian phalanx. This was the main trick of his plan. The Persian king expected that the chariots breaking into the ranks of the phalanx would disrupt its solid formation. He knew that the strength of the phalanx lay in its unity, in its closed shields and raised spears. If the chariots managed to create gaps, the Persian infantry would immediately rush into them. However, Alexander was not just a warrior. He was a brilliant strategist. He had excellent intelligence and was well aware of Darius's plan. He was not going to wait passively for his army to be torn apart. Instead, he came up with a brilliant and at the same time simple countermove that has been included in all military tactics textbooks. Forces entirely on this. He gave his phalanx an order that went against all the rules of warfare at the time. He ordered them not to hold their formation at all costs. Instead, the moment the chariots got dangerously close, the phalanx was to break ranks. The plan, dubbed Mousetrap, was told to every soldier. At the moment of the chariot attack, the front ranks of the phalanx were to spread out sharply to the sides, forming a kind of corridor. The rear ranks remained in place, closing in behind their comrades. The chariots, which had sped up to tremendous speed, could not stop or turn instantly. They flew through these living corridors without harming the main formation. They found themselves trapped, having passed through the phalanx and ended up in its rear, where Macedonian light infantry and soldiers from the rear ranks were already waiting for them. To victory. Crush them. Moreover, Alexander ordered his light infantry to advance at the moment of the chariot attack. Their task was to provoke the charioteers, throw javelins at them, and try to stop the horses as they approached. This created additional chaos and disrupted the rhythm of the attack. When the battle began, Darius threw his chariots into everything exactly according to Alexander's plan. The fearsome weapon on which the Persian king had pinned such hopes proved to be completely useless. Some of the chariots were stopped before they even got close, and those that made it to the phalanx just rushed through it like water through a sieve. The psychological effect was the opposite of what Darius had hoped for. His superweapon was neutralized with amazing ease. Not only did this not break the fighting spirit of the Macedonians, but on the contrary, it inspired them. They saw that their commander had foreseen everything. For the Persian army, however, it was the first and very painful blow to morale. If you think this tactical decision was brilliant, like this video, what if everything you've been taught about fair fighting doesn't matter when an empire is at stake? The choice of battlefield was the first strategic moment, and Darius believed he had outsmarted Alexander here. He chose a wide flat plain near the village of Gaugamela. This location was ideal for his army, which relied on having more soldiers and cavalry. He did not want a repeat of the mistake at Issus, where a narrow pass had crippled his army. Darius did not just choose the field, he prepared it. Thousands of workers spent several weeks leveling the ground and removing rocks and bushes. As already mentioned, this was done mainly for his scythe-shaped chariots so that nothing would slow down their acceleration. Ironically, this created ideal conditions for the Macedonian phalanx, which also needed a flat surface. The Persians had overwhelming numerical superiority. Although the exact numbers are a matter of debate among historians, most agree that Darius's army numbered between 100,000 and 250,000 men. Alexander had no more than 47,000. The ratio was at least 2-1, if not 5-1. Upon arriving at the site, Alexander immediately conducted a reconnaissance. He climbed a hill and saw with his own eyes the vast Persian army stretching for many kilometers. His generals, particularly Parmenion, were alarmed. They suggested attacking immediately under cover of night to take advantage of the element of surprise and hide the true size of the enemy army from their soldiers. A direct confrontation favors them. But Alexander rejected this plan. He considered a night attack unworthy and too risky. He wanted to win openly in broad daylight so that no one would have any doubts about his superiority. "I do not steal victory," was his response. He was confident in his tactical genius and in his soldiers. Alexander's decision also had an important psychological aspect. While the Macedonians rested, ate, and slept before the battle, Darius made a fatal mistake. Fearing the very night attack that Parmenion had proposed, he ordered his entire huge army to stay awake. I heard the Macedonians didn't even light fires. Tens of thousands of men spent the entire night on their feet in full combat readiness, peering into the darkness and waiting for an attack that never came. By morning, when the Macedonians, rested and full of energy, began to take to the field, the Persian army was already physically and mentally exhausted. They were tired, nervous, and hungry. Moreover, Darius had positioned his troops in advance, and they remained in that formation all night. This took away his flexibility. Alexander, on the other hand, built his army on the move in full view of the enemy, adapting his plan to the real situation. He already had the initiative before the first spear was thrown. The battlefield itself was huge. The wide front occupied by Darius's army stretched for several kilometers. This was his advantage, as he could try to outflank Alexander's short flanks, but it was also his weakness. Maintaining communication and coordination over such a vast area was almost impossible. Alexander understood this problem perfectly well. He saw that the Persian line was not only long but also thin in many places. His plan began to take shape at that very moment. Not to try to oppose the Persians across the entire front, but to find one point and strike it with all his might. Do you think Darius's decision to keep his army on its feet all night was a fatal mistake? In the next chapter, we will examine how Alexander positioned his troops to counter this enormous force. The formation Alexander chose at Gaugamela was a masterpiece. It is your leadership in the field, designed specifically to counter superior forces. He did not line up his army in a single long thin line as Darius had done. Such a formation would have been immediately flanked and destroyed. Instead, he used an echelon formation that was both flexible and stable. The heart of his army, as always, was the Macedonian phalanx divided into two parts. The left flank, which was to take the brunt of the Persian cavalry's attack, was commanded by his most experienced and reliable general, Parmenion. His task was to hold his position at all costs. He was the anchor of the entire army. Alexander personally led the right flank. This is where his elite units were located: the royal cavalry of the companions, the shield-bearers, the hypaspists, and the light infantry. But most importantly, he positioned his right flank not parallel to the Persian one, but at an angle, as if pulling it back. This was a tactical maneuver known as a diagonal formation or echelon. This maneuver had several goals. First, it artificially lengthened the front line, making it difficult for the Persians to surround it. Second, it created the false impression that Alexander was trying to bypass Darius's left flank. But the main goal was different: to provoke the Persian king into retaliating and stretching his own front. Behind the main line of the phalanx, Alexander placed a second line of infantry deployed at an angle. This was his reserve, ready at any moment to turn and repel an attack from the flanks or rear. He turned his army into a kind of mobile fortress capable of fighting on all four sides. This was unprecedented tactical flexibility for that time. Darius, seeing the Macedonian formation, ordered his left flank consisting of Bactrian and Scythian cavalry to attack Alexander's right flank. The Persian king saw that Alexander was shifting to the right and feared that he would move beyond the prepared level ground. Darius wanted to keep him in the center, on the chariot field. This was exactly what Alexander wanted. When the Persian cavalry rushed into the attack, the right flank of the Macedonians began a slow but steady movement to the right and forward. Each unit moved an echelon behind the previous one. This forced Darius to stretch the line further and further, trying to keep up with Alexander's maneuver. In the center of the Persian line, directly opposite Darius, were his best infantry, the Immortals. But because their left cavalry flank had rushed to the side and their right flank was also drawn into battle with Parmenion, tension began to build in the Persian center. The line, which was supposed to be solid, began to thin out. Alexander, at the head of his companions, watched this process closely. He had not yet entered the battle. He was waiting. He was waiting for the moment when the tension in the Persian formation would reach its limit, and the line would crack. He provoked Darius, forcing him to react to his actions. Hold the line. Do not let them pass. This dance on the right flank was key. The Persian cavalry, drawn into battle with the Macedonian light horsemen, gradually broke away from their infantry. They were confident of victory but did not notice that they were performing exactly the maneuver that Alexander needed. The battle turned into a giant tactical chess game. Darius moved his pieces in response to Alexander's moves. But Alexander was one step ahead. He did not simply react. He shaped the battlefield as he saw fit, leading the Persian king straight into the trap he had set. Everything was ready for the decisive blow. Guess what happened next when Darius did exactly what Alexander expected him to do? At some point, when the Persian cavalry on the left flank was finally drawn into the battle and broke away from its center, what Alexander had been counting on happened. A gap formed between the Persian center's infantry and their left cavalry wing. It was a narrow but noticeable opening in the solid wall of the Persian army. Alexander, who had been watching this section of the front intently, immediately gave the order. This was the moment he had been waiting for all night and all morning. He deployed his squadron of companions and several battalions of hypaspists, forming them into a powerful wedge-shaped strike force. This maneuver had been rehearsed to perfection. Alexander himself, in shining armor, took his place at the head of this wedge. He did not just give orders. He led the attack personally. This wedge, led by the king, did not strike the Persian infantry head-on. It rushed at full speed into the very gap that had formed in Darius's line. It was a surgically precise strike aimed not at the formation, but at the vulnerable space between the parts. The effect was stunning. The Macedonian wedge entered the Persian ranks like a knife through butter. They did not attack the immortals head-on, but flanked them, finding themselves at the very heart of the Persian formation. The goal of this strike was not just to break through, but one specific person, Darius III. The Persian king, watching the battle from his high chariot, suddenly saw a squadron of enemy cavalry led by Alexander himself rushing straight at him out of the dust and chaos. This was something he was not prepared for. His personal guard, brave warriors, tried to block their path, but they were crushed by this swift and unexpected attack. Act now before it's too late. For Darius and his entourage, it was a shock. The enemy was not somewhere on the flanks. He was here, a few dozen meters away. And his target was the King of Kings himself. Alexander's maneuver turned a tactical battle into a duel. And Darius was not ready to accept this challenge. Alexander's maneuver was incredibly risky. He exposed his own flank and left his infantry without cavalry cover. He staked everything on this one strike. If the Persian center had held, or if Darius had kept his cool, Alexander's wedge could have been surrounded and destroyed. But Alexander bet not only on tactics but also on psychology. He knew that the entire Persian army was a pyramid with Darius at its top. If you remove the top, the whole pyramid would collapse. And he was right. The breakthrough in the center was the culmination of the entire battle. It was the point of no return. All the complex maneuvers on the flanks, all the preparation of the battlefield, all the fatigue of the Persian army, all this was just a prelude to this 15-minute furious thrust into the heart of the enemy. Darius's soldiers in the center saw that their line had been broken and that the enemy was threatening the king himself. Confusion broke out in their ranks. They lost their formation and no longer knew whom to attack, the phalanx in front or the cavalry on their flank. Do you think this maneuver was too risky? In the next chapter, we will see how the Persian king reacted and what happened on the other equally important flank. At the moment when the wedge of companions led by Alexander broke through to Darius's chariot, the Battle of Gaugamela reached its climax. For the Persian king, the reality of battle had shifted from a tactical scheme to an immediate personal threat. He was the center of his universe and his army. And now that center was under direct attack. He saw before him not just an enemy commander, but a man who had come to take everything from him. To the chariot, quickly. Faced with this threat, Darius could not withstand it. He may have been a brave man, but he was also an emperor whose life was considered sacred. Seeing that his personal guard could not withstand the fierce onslaught of the Macedonians, he made a decision that determined the outcome not only of the battle but of the entire war. He ordered his charioteer to turn the chariot around and flee the battlefield. That moment marked the beginning of the end. As soon as the units closest to the king saw the royal standard retreating and the chariot racing away, their fighting spirit disappeared. Panic is contagious. It spread through the Persian center like wildfire. Soldiers who had been steadfastly holding their positions just a minute ago threw down their weapons and ran. The king's flight was a signal to everyone. If the King of Kings, for whom they had fought here, had abandoned them, what was the point of dying? The solid line of the Persian center, already weakened by tactical maneuvers, simply fell apart. Thousands of soldiers rushed away, trying to save their lives. Alexander, seeing Darius's flight, immediately organized a pursuit. He understood that as long as Darius was alive and free, the war was not over. He could gather a new army. Therefore, the Macedonian king, at the head of his cavalry, rushed in pursuit, trying to capture his enemy. Flank is ours. This flight in the center had disastrous consequences for the flanks of the Persian army. On the right Persian flank, the cavalry under the command of Mazias fought bravely and even pushed back Parmenian's Macedonians. They were on the verge of victory in their sector. But when news reached them that the center had been broken and the king had fled, their momentum weakened. Mazias's soldiers found themselves in an absurd situation. They were winning on their flank, but losing the entire battle. Their fighting spirit was broken not by the strength of the enemy, but by the weakness of their own leader. Soon, the right flank of the Persians began to retreat, slowly at first and then turned to flight. For Alexander, it was a triumph of his strategy. He proved that no matter how large an army is, it is only as strong as its leader and its spirit. He did not try to defeat 100,000 troops in fair combat. He found their Achilles' heel, Darius himself, and struck it precisely. Now the satrapy is lost. Darius was defeated. The panic on the battlefield was unimaginable. The huge army, which had seemed invincible that morning, turned into an uncontrollable crowd running in one direction. People and carts mingled in general chaos. It was a complete and unconditional defeat, caused not so much by military superiority as by psychological collapse. In pursuit of Darius, Alexander lost sight of the rest of the battlefield for a while. He was obsessed with the idea of catching the king. However, the battle, as it turned out, was not quite over yet. While the center and right flank of the Persians were fleeing, a no less dramatic story was unfolding on the left flank of the Macedonians. Darius's flight became a symbol of the fall of the entire Persian Empire. It was held together by the authority of one man. And when that man showed weakness, the whole structure collapsed. The Battle of Gaugamela was not just a defeat. It was a death sentence for the entire Achaemenid dynasty. While Alexander was chasing Darius and the Persian center was falling apart in panic, the situation on the left flank of the Macedonian army was close to catastrophic. Here, the old, experienced, and cautious general Parmenion was in command. His task was to hold out against the elite Persian and Indian cavalry under the command of the satrap Mazias, and this flank was barely holding. Mazias, unlike many other Persian commanders, proved to be a capable and decisive leader. His cavalry attacked fiercely and in a coordinated manner. They were able to outflank Parmenion and began to put enormous pressure on him. The Thessalian cavalry covering Parmenion fought desperately. But the Persians' numerical superiority was too great. At one point, part of the Persian cavalry broke through a gap in the Macedonian line and made a daring raid. They did not attack Parmenion's phalanx from the rear, which could have been fatal for the Macedonians. Instead, they rushed onward to the Macedonian camp, which was located behind the army. Their goal was not victory but looting. Keep working. There is no end to this. On the one hand, this raid on the camp distracted significant Persian forces from the main battle, but on the other hand, it created panic in the rear of the Macedonian army. Moreover, Parmenion, seeing that his flank was surrounded and the enemy was already rampaging in the rear, found himself in a desperate situation. His formation began to crack at the seams. Parmenion, realizing that he could not hold out alone, sent a messenger to Alexander with a desperate plea for help. He informed the king that his flank was surrounded and would be destroyed if he did not receive immediate support. This message caught Alexander in the midst of his pursuit of Darius. This was perhaps the most difficult tactical choice of Alexander's life. He was so close to his main goal, Darius. Capturing the Persian king would mean an immediate end to the war. But at the same time, his army and his loyal general Parmenion were on the verge of destruction. This crisis on the left flank showed how dangerous the Macedonian situation was. Despite the brilliant breakthrough in the center, the battle was not yet won. The Persian army was so large that its various parts could act independently. And while the center was fleeing, the right flank of the Persians was close to victory. Mazias himself apparently did not know about Darius's flight. He continued to fight, carrying out his orders. His soldiers did not see the panic in the center and were confident of their success. This created a paradoxical situation. At one end of the field, there was a chase, and at the other, a desperate defense. The bravery and fortitude of Parmenian's soldiers were incredible. Being veterans, they did not give in to panic. They regrouped, forming a square, and repelled attacks from several sides. But their strength was running out. They desperately needed help. The situation required Alexander to make an immediate decision. He was forced to choose between personal triumph, capturing Darius, and saving his army. This choice demonstrated the difference between an adventurer and a true commander responsible for the lives of his men. Parmenian's message reached Alexander a few kilometers from the battlefield. He could see Darius's chariot, his main target, moving away, but he also heard about the mortal danger threatening his left flank. At that moment, Alexander showed himself not as a man possessed by the hunt, but as a responsible commander-in-chief. He made a difficult but correct decision. They broke the line. With a heavy heart, he ordered the pursuit of Darius to be stopped. He turned his squadron of companions, exhausted from the breakthrough and pursuit, and led them back to the battlefield to help Parmenion. He sacrificed the opportunity to end the war immediately in order to save his soldiers. This act only strengthened the army's boundless loyalty to their king. Alexander's return was as swift as his attack. He struck Mazias's victorious but now disorganized cavalry from the rear and flank. For the Persians, who were confident that they were about to crush Parmenion, this came as a complete surprise. They did not expect the cavalry that had just broken through their center to return. At that moment, Mazias probably received news of Darius's flight. Seeing that the center of their army had fled and that Alexander's elite cavalry had now struck them from behind, the Persian cavalry finally lost heart. Their fierce onslaught gave way to panic. Those who had been hunters just a minute ago had now become prey. The formation of the Persian cavalry on the right flank fell apart. They found themselves caught between a hammer, Alexander's companions, and an anvil, Parmenian's steadfast phalanx. Now they were forced to flee, and their retreat was disorderly. Do not break formation. We must lure them away from here. Alexander's maneuver, refusing to pursue and returning to save his flank, was a tactical masterpiece. It demonstrated his ability to think big and make difficult decisions in critical situations. He did not let his emotions get the better of his reason and strategic necessity. Advance the assault. With the defeat of Mazias's cavalry, the Battle of Gaugamela was finally won. The Persian army ceased to exist as an organized force. It turned into a huge, uncontrollable mass of refugees scattered across the Mesopotamian plain. The Macedonians, tired but inspired, controlled the entire field. The victory was complete and unconditional. Alexander did not simply defeat Darius's army. He destroyed it. He proved the complete superiority of his tactics, his army, and his spirit. To the bridge. After them. Darius himself, thanks to Alexander's sacrifice, managed to escape pursuit and hide. He fled towards his eastern satrapies to Media, hoping to gather a new army there. But his authority was forever undermined. He fled the battlefield, and that was something the satraps could not forgive. Alexander, on the other hand, remained in control of the situation. He saved his army, won a great victory, and opened the way to the heart of the Persian Empire. The road to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis was open. This victory was the result not only of a brilliant strike in the center, but also of a timely and cool-headed decision to save his left flank. It was a victory of system, discipline, and brilliant command over chaos, numerical superiority, and indecision. The Battle of Gaugamela had consequences far beyond its military significance. The defeat on the battlefield marked not only a victory but also the actual destruction of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. The empire, which had ruled most of the known world for more than 2 centuries, collapsed in an instant, marking the end of Persia's political dominance. From that day on, despite its attempts to resist, the Persian Empire never recovered and was unable to regain its former power. After Darius's flight, the system of satrapies that had maintained the stability of the empire began to collapse rapidly. One of the first to realize the futility of further resistance was a Persian nobleman named Mazias. Fighting on the right flank at the Battle of Gaugamela, he realized that there was no point in continuing the struggle, and succumbing to pressure, surrendered Babylon without a fight. And from this point on, he voluntarily defected to Alexander, who showed mercy by leaving him as satrap of the city. Alexander demonstrated his policy not as a destroyer, but as a new ruler, which strengthened his position in the region and guaranteed the support of the local elites. Babylon was the first city to open its gates to Alexander, and its surrender only accelerated the fall of the empire. Babylon was followed by Susa, one of the most important capitals of the empire. The city opened its gates, and Alexander got his hands on the incredibly rich royal treasury that had accumulated over centuries. Catalogue the weaponry immediately. We must finish. These riches allowed Alexander not only to reward his army but also to secure funding for further campaigns. The reserves of gold, precious stones, and other resources played a key role in sustaining Alexander's ambitions and troops, providing his campaigns with financial resources. Susa was only an intermediate milestone. Alexander then moved on to Persepolis, the sacred and cultural capital of Persia, which was not only a symbol of the empire's power but also its spiritual center. Alexander, depriving the Persians of their symbol of greatness, not only captured the city but also destroyed it. The royal palace was burned down, and the city was looted. Secure the shipment routes immediately. This act was an important symbolic gesture that signified the end of the old Persian dynasty. It was both an act of revenge for the ancient Greco-Persian wars and a gesture of power by the new conqueror who had no intention of leaving a stone unturned of what his enemies had built. Darius himself, despite his escape, was unable to raise a new army to oppose Alexander. His authority was destroyed, and he became a king without a kingdom. He found himself in the position of a man who, despite his title, was unable to rule and control his lands. His own satraps, including Bessus the satrap of Bactria, began to see him not as a leader but as an obstacle to restoring order. They understood that Alexander would pursue their ruler to the end, and this betrayal was inevitable. The spoils will be worth the effort. In the end, Darius fell victim to betrayal. The satraps, including Bessus, captured him. And then, when Alexander's vanguard approached, they betrayed their king. They inflicted fatal wounds on him and left him to die on the road. It was an inglorious end for the great king who had tried to maintain his power until the very end. Alexander, having caught up with the traitors, found only a dying Darius, who was already helpless and deprived of any last hope of restoring his power. This moment became an important turning point in history and a symbol of the end of a great dynasty. After Darius's death, Alexander became the legitimate heir to the Persian Empire. From that moment on, he began the process of merging Greek and Persian cultures, which marked the beginning of a new era, Hellenism. He actively married Persian princesses, welcomed Persian nobles into his circle, and recruited Persian youths into his army. Forward. We are one people, one empire, bridging the East. It was a historic moment when the East and West began to merge, and Alexander became a symbol of this new culture, uniting two great civilizations. This policy strengthened his power and ensured his rule not only through military success but also through cultural fusion. And your theories explain the anomalies against us. The Battle of Gaugamela was a decisive turning point in world history. This battle not only secured Alexander's victory but also opened the East to Greek culture, science, and philosophy, which had a huge impact on the further development of civilizations. At the same time, Alexander introduced the Greeks to the incredible riches and traditions of the East, which had a significant impact on his political and cultural legacy. This process became the basis for the formation of the Hellenistic world, which lasted for several centuries. The world thus was never the same again, and new eras began to dictate their own rules and conditions. It is used in our finest ceremonies. The victory at Gaugamela was not only due to great tactical and strategic decisions but also to an understanding of the enemy's psychology. Alexander used an echelon formation to stretch the Persian lines, created a mousetrap for their chariots, and delivered a decisive blow to the gap that had formed, deliberately targeting Darius himself. This tactical mastery was the crowning achievement of Alexander's military career, demonstrating how discipline, training, and personal leadership can overcome an army that greatly outnumbers one's own. Vulnerable to their skirmishes, a valid concern. The legacy of Gaugamela was not limited to military victory. It became a symbol of the birth of a new world, a new order in which the cultural and political elements of East and West were mixed. This battle opened new horizons for civilization, showing that in a world where culture and power can coexist, a new era can be born. We have seen how in a single day on the plain of Gaugamela, the fate of an entire era was decided. Alexander's brilliant tactics, his coolness, and personal courage clashed with the huge but clumsy machine of the Persian Empire. The result was not just the defeat of one army, but the collapse of an entire world and the birth of a new Hellenistic one. This signifies the unity between Macedon and Babylon. Gaugamela is a classic example of asymmetric warfare, where strategy and psychology prove more important than numerical superiority. Alexander did not simply defeat Darius. He outplayed him at every stage, from choosing the time for battle to the decisive strike at the very heart of the enemy formation. Gold secures our future. It will finance. What other great battles or tactical geniuses of the past interest you? Perhaps you would like to learn about Hannibal's maneuvers at Cannae, or the steadfastness of the Romans at Alesia. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new in-depth dives into history.